Okay, and now we're going to come to the mother of all assessments, right? Because at the end, we want our students to be able to use all of the skills that we have assessed prior to this so that they can use those skills to come to some ability to create meaning from a text, so comprehension. So the last video on assessing practices is going to look at assessing comprehension. So we're going to explore the nature of a comprehension assessment, connect comprehension assessment to instructional strategy, and identify the role of assessment in the reading classroom. All right, so when we test comprehension, we want to think of it as a continuum of testing. So first thing we definitely want to do is be able to ask easy questions that students can answer with limited help. They can help us to understand the students at least got a superficial understanding. So literal questions might ask things like sequence, what happened before, what happened after, cause and effect, relationships, maybe comparisons, maybe character traits. These might be difficult to write an assessment that allows teachers to dig into a skill that a student's may be lacking, but it helps us to at least establish that they read the text to begin with, right? And that they have a starting off point. So then we can move to inferential questions. These like literal questions have more of a yes/no answer, a factual answer, but answers can't be located in the text themselves. The reader has to demonstrate their use of logic to show how they've arrived at their answer. These might look like an either/or type of question. They might be somewhat speculative, so a lot of depends on them being able to explain their reasoning, their logic. And then the last kind of question that a teacher might ask are critical questions, where you're asked to create value judgments. These are not right or wrong. These are all very complex questions where the students are really kind of making value judgments and assertions about the text itself. So, those really are something that you want to consider when you're ready to ask those critical questions. The student has to be very familiar with the text before they can really think critically about it. Okay. All right, so one of the things we want to think about when we're creating comprehension questions is whether or not we are actually asking text-dependent questions. So here you can see, here's the text. Crows are large black birds that pose a threat to farmers. They belong to the genus Corvus. So the first question, what color are crows? That's text dependent, but the student can also answer knowing their own knowledge of crows. Have you ever had a pet crow? That is completely student knowledge, right? What genus do crows belong to? Now we're getting into passage content. And then how long do crows usually live? Generally, that is something that if you'll see, it would be something that we wouldn't know, so it wouldn't be our background knowledge, but it's not answerable in the text, so that's why it's outside of the circle. So we want to think about text dependency. We want to make sure that we're asking questions that are dependent on the text to at least some extent, and we want to make sure that many of the questions are dependent on the text beyond, outside of the student's knowledge, so that we make sure that they're, gaining knowledge from the text. And we want to make sure that we're not asking questions that can't be answered within the passage. So text dependency is something that we need to think about. Comprehension, we want to think about assessment for reading comprehension. We want to think about how how do we look for, what do we need to go through when we are trying to decide whether or not a student is comprehending something. So we know that language comprehension is dependent on vocabulary and text sentence structures. So we want to, be able to look back. So we want to be able to follow that continuum to see, if a student is having problems with language comprehension, can we figure out which component, which pathway. Another thing that we want to be able to do, the students have strategic knowledge that they're deploying for reading. So are they, so when we're looking backwards, if we find a problem, can we identify their understanding of purposes for reading, or can we understand their strategies that they might use for reading? So comprehension is not just about poor decoding and a lack of background knowledge. There are sometimes poor reading strategy developments that we want to dig into. So these are the things that we could look at beyond decoding skills. So if we find that our students, and that we will find students that have decoding skills, but are still not performing well in comprehension. And these are some of the places that we can look at. All right, so we want to think about whether or not poor decoding skills that's the easiest place to go. I got a student not comprehending. First thing I want to check is their decoding skills. Why? Because decoding skills are what we would call a constrained skill. We want to consider discrete specific skills like phonics and fluency that helps us to, things that are very easily measured, okay? But in some instances that gives us half of the picture. In other instances, maybe they're fine with their decoding, right? And so then we want to move into what we call the unconstrained skills. Is comprehension hindered by word identification and language? These are unconstrained. They get more difficult as the students age through. These are, to be able to identify these, you want to have the students do things like listen, read, and discuss strategies in the classroom. Maybe make sure that you're offering background knowledge for the students so that you're eliminating background knowledge as the source of the problem. But when you get to the point where you're identifying unconstrained skills, you're in a much more challenging area for assessment. So what we want to think about then is comprehension hindered by poorly developed strategies. So if our students have decoding skills, demonstrate decoding skills, are fairly fluent, grade level fluent or close to grade level fluent, yet they're still really struggling with comprehension, one of the places to look at is whether or not they have poorly developed reading strategies. And here's a quote that I want you to consider. Reading strategies are deliberate, goal-oriented attempts to control and modify the reader's efforts to decode text, understand words, and construct meanings of text. Reading skills are automatic actions that result in decoding and comprehension with speed, efficiency, and fluency, and usually occur without awareness of the components or control over it involved. The reader's deliberate, goal-oriented directness defines the strategy at work. So what this tells us is that we really want to look to the strategies that the National Reading Panel identified as places for us to, as instructional strategies for us to teach, reading strategies for us to teach students. Those include, are we helping our students monitor their own reading? Are we asking them high-level comprehension questions? Are we asking them to generate questions about the text as they read? Are we asking them to identify and organize ideas based on text structure? Are we asking students to summarize the text and to continue to increase or add to that summary as they continue through the text? And so we want to think about, too, the idea of applying prior knowledge and helping our students to create mental images. These are all things that we can do with our students to help them with reading strategies they can deploy as they're reading to be able to develop stronger literacy skills. So one thing you might consider is to explicitly teach reading strategies, and to offer a gradual release of responsibility, where you are showing them or requiring them to do these actions, but then you back off of that and it becomes sort of a mindset. Really, strategies are supposed to become mindsets. They're supposed to be something that students decide what strategy they need and when they need it. Think alouds are something that really we have helped us to understand what's going on with readers and to help us to understand the cognitive complexities of reading. So what we can do is ask our students to participate in think alouds in front of us, right? So what would you look for if a student was thinking aloud about a passage? What do proficient readers do when they run into minor predicaments where there's something that's like causing them some trouble? They might read ahead to see if they can resolve the problem. They might go back and reread. They might reflect on what has been read to see if they can come up with an alternative. and they might seek information beyond the text. So if you have your students, you have a student that is able to do the decoding part, you see them struggling, one of the things you might consider doing is having them do think aloud and look to see which strategies, if any, you see them deploying, and then maybe prompt them to deploy some of these strategies. One thing I want to talk about is the importance of having student-generated questions. Too often in our literacy classrooms, we are the question generators and the students you learn to just answer it, right? Well, learning how to incorporate good questions into the classroom is, while challenging, probably one of the most rewarding as in terms of achievement instructional strategies that you can do. So there are a number of models where the students are developing the questions. So there's Manzo's request, where students are coached into asking questions that become increasingly more focused. There's the question-answer relationship strategy that teaches students to consider questions that are right in the text, that are based on patterns that they see in the text, and then have them reflect on and consider the whole text. There's questioning circles that ask students to consider questions that they have about a text, about its relationship to themselves and its relationship to the world. So there are lots of different models that help you that you can use, and you can look these up, but you want to help scaffold students' inquiry so that students learn to ask questions themselves of the text. Okay. So one thing that you can do is to teach your students to summarize, but one of the things we know is that it often becomes difficult for our students to do more than just list the topic. We want to get them to the main idea, right? And we want to get them to not just identify what the main idea or what the topic is, we want them what is said about that topic. So I put together some, these are 3 names of people who have really good templates that you could bring in that teach your students how to get to a good summary. So Harold Graff, Barbara Taylor, Jack Hayes, what they do is they give your students sort of a template that they can use so that we're digging, they're not just identifying the topic or the main idea, this is what this is about, but they're really being asked to dig into what was the passage saying about that main idea. Another thing that I'm a huge fan of is to move away from questions at the end of a text or reading guides and move into graphic organizers. And so let me just show you a quick video on graphic organizers. Oh, sorry. Don't know why that didn't show up. Graphic organizers. So, graphic organizers, let me just show you, I guess I'll show you this one. No, that's not the one that I was looking for. Here we go. Here is...
A lot of times what we need to do is we need to teach kids how to think about subjects from different perspectives. And so what the conversational roundtable looks like is...
So this is Jim Burke, and he's probably my favorite my guru of graphic designs. In fact, I think or graphic organizers, I think if you took my other classes, I show that same video. But graphic organizers and reading guides, I prefer graphic organizers. They're more open-ended. They prepare students to think about the reading as they go, and they are they're very student-centered. It's not right or wrong so much as the students being able to explore their own thinking. So it goes back to that self-monitoring question. So the question becomes, what can proficient readers do? There was a mega study in 1983 that looked at a number of observational studies and identified the difference between proficient and non-proficient readers. And what they found was that proficient readers tend to have a greater focus on comprehension in their lessons. Struggling readers are more focused on things like word recognition, decoding. When they miss a word, proficient readers are more likely to give meaning cues than a struggling reader is, who tend to look to decoding cues instead. Proficient readers are interrupted fewer times during their lessons than struggling readers. by things like, oh, I don't know that word or whatever. They're able to move past those disruptions. Proficient readers are more likely to read a whole story during a reading period. Struggling readers kind of need to portion that story out. They don't have the stamina, and that becomes, then they're also relying on memory, if they have to pick it back up in a little bit. Proficient readers are more likely to read silently, whereas struggling readers are more likely to need to read aloud. So that's a really big tip. If you have a kid that when you're asking the kids to read quietly, you notice that his lips have to move or he has to be speaking out loud, that's kind of a good tip for you that maybe the student is more of a struggling reader than you realize. Proficient readers cover more materials in the course and in the school year than struggling readers do. So no surprise there, reading difficulties begin to have an effect on the students' content area learning as well. So this is important for you to remember. Sorry, I saw that mistake there. So we want to consider that our students, are proficient readers, and we want that there are certain habits that they do. We want to be able to develop those habits. So because practice in reading is related to progress, here's the problem. The gap between struggling and proficient readers only widens as our students age up. And that's really a problem that we've identified in school. We need to find a way to diminish this gap more quickly so that, it's very telling. Third grade reading scores are very highly correlative to things like dropout rates. And so we know that something has to change in order for us to mind that gap. And so, comprehension is definitely important there. So one of the things that we find is students that are poor readers learn to become reading avoidant.
In high school, did you do the required reading?
No.
Like any of it?
None.
None of it?
None.
Wow.
I think I read probably 2.
Out of 3 years?
Me too.
Out of the 3 years, probably 25. But 2 that I can remember actually reading.
I didn't really do it.
Did you do any of it?
Fast Food Nation, I skimmed the first chapter and then I put it down because it was boring.
So I use this. Penny Kittle is somebody, she's a huge advocate for choice, but I use this as a way to talk about what happens is as the students get more frustrated and see that gap widen between them and proficient readers, struggling readers will start to learn to avoid reading altogether. And obviously what that does is just continue to contribute to that gap. So we want to consider then that we want to think about other dimensions of reading achievement, like using reading inventories and interviews as a way to understand students and how they perceive themselves as readers so that we can really work on building them. We want to include choice when possible. We want to teach reading skills using technology, audiovisuals, graphic novels, other unschooled type of media that might help to develop the skills that the students need for reading. We want to think about how to find culturally relevant books that are responsive to our students' lived experiences. And we want to really look at how we can talk with and to students about books and how we allow students to talk about books. So, all that said, how do I assess comprehension? Good question. We want to think about comprehension in terms of, we really, really want to think about that assessment stool here, because curriculum, assessment, and instruction, we really want to think about the role that assessment plays in helping to support our students and their student learning, okay? And so assessment is key, and when it comes to comprehension questions, we really want to be deploying all the 3 main types, pre-formative and summative assessment. So what makes a good assessment? A good assessment is done with the student's best interest in mind, meaning it's proprietary. It's got utility, it's useful, it's informative, it's timely, it's influential. Not everything can be an essay test, because essay tests are going to take us a lot longer. Constructive response tests are going to take us a lot longer to grade, right? Feasibility, we need to make sure that they can be implemented as planned. And accuracy, we need to make sure that they lead to sound and valid information. So when we go to create our own comprehension tests, where should we begin? We really should begin with the standards. We want to unpack the standards, and we want to check for Bloom's taxonomy. We want to look for what content might be contained within the standard. Then we want to plan carefully. We map out the objectives, we determine the emphasis, and then we move to the assessment type. There's a lot that you can cover in reading comprehension, because it's such an unconstrained skill that really, before you even write, before you give that assessment, you need to know where you are getting that students to. I was a big backwards design person, which means that I would start with the standards, create the assessment, and then plan to make sure that I was making that everything we did in the class was getting them ready for that assessment. I can't spend the whole class looking at character traits and then give my student a test where I'm asking them to look at cause and effect, right? I need to make sure that what I'm doing, and when we're talking about, by the time we're talking about 4th, 5th grade and up, kids could be reading that same text for 2-3 weeks. We could be talking about whole class novels. So we want to be sure that the things that we're doing through day to day are preparing our students for those comprehension questions. We want to make sure that when we're responding to the assessments, it doesn't end with just scoring it, right? If a student doesn't do well on those assessments, what are the interventions that I might consider? What are the modifications that I might need to make for that student? What further probing, maybe how do I start to decide whether or not it's comprehension or decoding skills, right? Or what role lack of background knowledge might have had. When do I let my students redo things? And how do I use that redo option as a way to help my students? So comprehension and comprehension questions, they tend to be teacher directed, but they're also extremely complex. And you want to think about what information you can do to help to identify your students' ability to create meaning from a text.